Heritage Foundation. And first off, I just want to say what a pleasure it has been for Heritage to partner with TPPF on this excellent event. And I think we've saved the panel we've saved almost for last the best panel, right? Prosperity and poverty, the energy factor. But I'd like to take just 1 second to tell you a little bit about a project that Kathleen and I have worked on for many, many years. It's a series of environmental principles that are consistent with individual freedom, free markets, and limited government, and can effectively challenge the status quo environmental worldview. We call it the American conservation ethic. We've been steadily promoting this for a couple of years now, and out in the hall you can find a smaller pamphlet that lists the principles. Our first target was getting these things into circulation by getting them embedded in the platform at the Republican Convention in Orlando, and they're all in there, and we hope they stay. The reason I mention this project, the American Conservation Ethic, is that it's about environmental worldviews, contradicting environmental worldviews. I think it's at the heart of the panel that we now have. I'm going to go quickly and introduce our speakers in the order that they will speak, and you have an excellent lineup before you. First will be Dr. Calvin Beisner, who's the founder and national spokesman for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. He's the founder and not only founder and national spokesman for the Alliance, but was the principal author of the Cornwall Declaration. He's an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies at Covenant College and historical theology and social ethics at Knox Theological Seminary, formerly. He has written over 10 books. He's testified as an expert witness on ethics of environment, climate, and energy policies before committees of the U.S. House and Senate, and lectured on the subject for the Vatican and for the annual International Conference on Climate Change. Next, we'll have Caleb Stewart Rossiter, adjunct professor, School of International Service, and adjunct professor, Department of Mathematics and Statistics, College of Arts and Sciences at American University. He's the co-director of the American Exceptionalism Media Project. He worked on the congressional staff of the Arms Control and Foreign Policy Caucus, as well as for Representative Bill Delahunt. In the 1990s, he founded and directed the research and advocacy group Demilitarization for Democracy. He was a full-time professor at AU School of International Service in the 2000s. As I mentioned before, he's currently an adjunct professor at American, both in the School of International Service and the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. He's written many books and written dozens of articles and reports on U.S. foreign policy, African politics, and most recently, and appropriately for this gathering, on climate change. In 1973, he became the youngest elected school board member in New York State. That was recent, right?
That was the last election I won.
Following Mr. Rosser, we'll have, Professor Rosser will have Leighton Seward. Leighton is president and chairman of Plants Need CO2, a theory, something we've heard a few times already during this gathering. He's a geologist and environmentalist, a former chairman the Institute for the Study of Earth and Man at SMU, former advisory board member at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, twice chairman of the Audubon Nature Institute, a fine institution, former chairman of the National Wetlands Coalition, former chairman of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, honorary director of the API, a recipient of EPA's Environmental Excellence Award, and chosen to go on the presidential missions to the USSR and Turkey and Pakistan. He's currently on a new mission to educate the public on the benefits of CO2 and its lack of impact on Earth's climate. And finally, we'll have Kathleen Hartnett-White, who I suspect doesn't need much of an introduction by this point. Kathleen served as a six-year term as chairman and commissioner of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. She also served formerly then Governor George Bush as an appointee to the Texas Water Development Board. She also served on the Texas Economic Development Commission and the Environmental Flows Study Commission. She's recently completed her term for the Lower Colorado River Authority. She sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Regulatory Science, the Texas Emission Reduction Advisory Board, and the Texas Water Foundation. Her writings, prolific, have appeared in National Review, Investor's Business Daily, Forbes, Daily Caller, and so forth. And she's regularly testified before the United States House and Senate. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cal Beisner.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's a privilege to be here, and it is a little strange for somebody with my background to be here addressing this sort of a gathering, but I hope perhaps I can make it make a little bit of sense. I'll start with the fact that my earliest picture memories are of two things. One, the very beautiful red flowers hanging from a vine in a tree in the courtyard of the apartment building in Calcutta, India, where my family lived while my father was working with the USIA in Calcutta. I was a toddler at the time. And those were very beautiful, and ever since then, the idea of the beauty of God's creation has been one of the motivating factors in my life. The other picture memory from the same time and the same locale is of the dead bodies of the people who had died of starvation and disease overnight, lying on the sidewalks, where every morning my nurse, my ayah, would walk me down several blocks to the family where I would spend the day because my mother was paralyzed with a virus that attacked her spinal cord. She later fully recovered, but for a time I was farmed out to an Indian family. That memory imprinted on me the horrors of poverty. And those two things together have helped to motivate a great deal of my life. I'm going to skip way ahead here through a variety of different channels. I began to study and write a lot on the combination of biblical ethics and theology and economics and how those impact the population, resource, and environment nexus of challenges. Some would call them problems. I say they're more opportunities. And that led to eventually my drafting what became the Cornwall Declaration on Environmental Stewardship, which was endorsed initially by about 1,500 or so religious leaders from around the world, and later by thousands of lay people. It continues to be widely recognized. In 2005, along with a group of others of like mind, I founded what became called the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We are a network of Christian theologians and scientists and economists, as well as other scholars, about 60 in the network spread around North America, working together to promote three things. The biblical earth stewardship, or what we call godly dominion, which is men and women created in the image of God working together to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors, thus fulfilling the two great commands to love God and to love neighbor. The second being economic development for the very poor, think primarily in terms of sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of Asia and Latin America. And the third being the proclamation and defense of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we try to integrate all of those in what we do. Just last week, we issued a new declaration, and some of you will have seen copies of that here. I have one copy of it right here in my hand. There are some stacks on the ends of various tables down there, and there's also a stack on the resource table out in the hallway. This declaration is designed to make the case that abundant, affordable, reliable energy, especially in the form of electricity, is absolutely crucial to lifting societies out of poverty and keeping them out of poverty, And since hydrocarbons or fossil fuels are the most efficient means of obtaining abundant, affordable, reliable energy, especially in the form of electricity, therefore fossil fuels should be something that we all celebrate, and indeed for which we should make no apology whatsoever. It is time for us to turn from saying, yeah, we know fossil fuels have a lot of problems in terms of pollution, but at least they provide abundant, affordable, reliable electricity for people, to saying instead, well, of course, all technologies have risks, but we provide abundant, affordable, reliable electricity for people all around the world and other forms of energy, and that raises people out of poverty, and that is a good win-win situation. And we also provide a huge increase in plant growth efficiency all around the world. We are, with no charge to you whatsoever, we are fertilizing the world, greening the planet, and adding to agricultural crop yields all around the world, such that, for instance, a major study done by Craig Idso, released last year, surveying hundreds of studies done over a period of about 40 or 50 years, calculated, and it's rough, of course, but it's even if it's in the ballpark, it's significant, calculated the value of added crop yields over the last period from 60 to 2012 was $3.2 trillion. And if you take the projections of where CO2 is going from now to 2050, we will add an additional $9.8 trillion worth of crop yield. That's magnificently important for the poor. The kinds of policies that the Obama administration, that the UN IPCC, that others want us to adopt to mitigate global warming would require turning from the most abundant, affordable, reliable energy sources to diffuse, expensive, unreliable energy sources, jacking up the cost not only of energy but of everything else, since everything we do depends on energy for our performance of it. That hurts the poor more than anybody else, because the poor on average spend a higher percentage of their income on energy than does anybody else. On average in the United States, a family in the bottom quintile spends about 20% of its income on energy, whereas average families spend about 10% of their income on energy. You have an increase in energy prices and you hurt the poor more than anybody else. The irony of that is that, of course, that means that that kind of policy is in essence a regressive tax. It taxes the poor at a higher rate than it does the wealthy. It's particularly ironic that those who call themselves progressives would embrace a policy that is in essence a regressive tax. I began by referring to my picture memory of poverty on the streets of Calcutta in the 1950s. I will end by saying this, that it is immoral, it is unconscionable to embrace a policy that not only harms the poor in developed countries more than anyone else, but, if widely embraced around the world, condemns the developing world to more generations of the abject poverty that leads to high rates of disease and premature death. We have a moral case to argue here, and I believe that it is a winning case. We are working hard at winning that, particularly in the religious circles in the United States, but we speak to other circles as well. I would appreciate your passing on the information. Pick up a copy of this declaration that we have put out. Pick up several copies. Share it with friends. Write a note over the top of it and send it to your mayor, to your city councilman, to your state legislators, to your members of Congress. This is the kind of thinking that I embrace. I want this represented in our policy making. We can spread the news on this. Go to cornwallalliance.org and click on the link that will appear right there on the home page to the declaration, Protect the Poor, 10 Reasons to Oppose Harmful Climate Change Policies. You can endorse the declaration online, joining over 150 who had endorsed it when we first released it last week, including scientists, economists, theologians, ministry leaders, and others, including, by the way, over 21 climate scientists specifically. So this is not anti-science, this is not denialism or anything else of that nature. It's good science, it's good economics, and it's good ethics. So I thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you, and I hope to meet many of you through the rest of the day.
Hello, Houston. Mr. Gordon, how long do I have?
10 minutes, I believe.
10 minutes. Telling a professor to cover a topic in 10 minutes, I was looking for an analogy, is like telling Akeem Olajuwon to put on my coat. It don't fit. I'll do what I can. You won't have to say a word to me. I'll press my button, and I promise I'll stop then. As a card-carrying member of the American foreign policy left, in the words of Admiral Stockdale when he ran for vice president, what am I doing here? Working on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House in the late 2000s when the Democrats came back into power, I was, of course, the only climate skeptic on the staff and had lots of good arguments with the members. Teaching at my university, at American University, I've got to be the only climate skeptic on the campus, and I get into lots of arguments. Working in the non-governmental world with the left-wing think tanks, I'm the only climate skeptic there. Well, I was. I just got fired, but that's another matter. And looking out on you all, I feel like Saul Alinsky, the famous radical organizer in Chicago, who once was praised by the Chicago Tribune for something he'd done. And he came into the office and he said to the staff, "Don't worry, boys. We'll get over this storm of approval and going back to being hated in no time." So I've got about 9 minutes to be hated. I'm looking forward to it. Houston has been very important to me in my career as an anti-war and anti-imperialist activist. It's one of the reasons I jumped at the invitation by Ms. White to come down here. I worked closely with the late Mickey Leland in Congress. I was with him writing a report on U.S. policy in the developing world right before he took his fateful trip to Ethiopia and passed away, with a number of my friends on the plane with him. I traveled recently with Sheila Jackson Lee to Pakistan when I was on the congressional staff to meet with the president there to encourage him to respect the results of the election. I worked for and was a dear friend of Dominique de Menil of the Rothko Chapel with all of her work trying to promote peace in Central America. And of course, I was turned on to that by my dearest friend in the state of Texas, Ms. Frances Tarleton Sissy Farenthold, who's here today. Come on now, you didn't vote for her, but you can clap for her. So when I think of Houston, I think of the time Nelson Mandela came here to address the Rothko Chapel 1 year after he came out of jail. And he, when I rushed up to him to have the chance, because I was on the staff of the Rothko Chapel, just to meet Mr. Mandela. I'm an Africanist, and so I was very interested. And I told him I'd been involved in the anti-apartheid divestment movement while working in the Congress. And he said, "Oh, those lovely American college students and their anti-apartheid divestment actions on campus. Without them, I'd still be in jail." Now, he was being kind of kind because many things had to come together for the South African whites to realize it was a better deal to hand over the economy, hand over the government than to hand over the economy, and things have worked out very well for them. But it's true, the American divestment anti-apartheid movement to push corporations to divest, to push universities and municipalities to divest from using having stocks in companies working in South Africa was a very important part of the movement for a free South Africa. I'm troubled today that Mandela's legacy has been hijacked because Archbishop Tutu, who is a great leader for peace in South Africa, who I've worked with, is the real moral leader of a new divestment campaign that you must have heard about if you're anywhere near a college campus, which is to decarbonize, meaning sell all your energy stocks because of fears of climate catastrophe. I have spoken out firmly, and I hope to convince you a bit today, that this would be a disastrous policy for the people of Africa and a mistake for Mandela's legacy to take the anti-apartheid divestment campaign and apply it to energy stocks at universities. Let me show you a slide or two as I walk my way through this. Can we try this, or is this going to work? Oh, I don't know what to do. Green? Look at that. This is a slide I use with my statistics students to show them the difference between correlation and causation, which is a principle of basic statistics, and also to explain to them that bivariate plots in the real world, meaning one thing driving another, are usually misleading, because there's usually a number of causes that confound the picture. But this one shows a remarkable thing. It's got nothing to do with human beings, nothing to do with SUVs, nothing to do with burning coal to make electricity. This is simply the pattern every 100,000 years of global mean temperature going up and down in our world about 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? And the blue line that goes with it is, the blue line is the temperature and the red line is carbon dioxide levels. Obviously, as Al Gore famously says in his movie, they go together. His implication, of course, is that carbon dioxide levels drive temperature. The little line at the end that's going straight up is where carbon dioxide goes, and he's trying to convince you that temperature is going to follow. So this is the classic chart that's used to prove that temperature is being driven by carbon dioxide. Of course, you're all smart enough to know the relationship is exactly the opposite. As the temperature goes up and down, carbon dioxide goes with it. The reason I became somewhat of a climate skeptic is because of this chart. We know that this is linked mathematically almost perfectly to the fact that every 100,000 years, the Earth's orbit around the sun goes from a perfect circle, where it is today, to about a 5% ellipse. The numbers are too good to say that that's not the case. The only problem is there's no physicist alive that can tell you how that happens. The difference in insulation hitting the Earth because of a 5% ellipse is not different enough from a 0% ellipse to account for the massive power it takes to turn around, despite massive levels of carbon dioxide, the temperature every 100,000 years and brings it down. And I began to wonder, since I work on models, how could we model, if you'll show me the next slide, how could we model recent temperature changes? Oh, I can show you the next slide. I don't want that one. Let me see what else I can find here. That's not what I want. I want to go backwards? Good. I'm looking for, no, I guess I've got one missing there. It's the bottom of that page. Don't worry about it. It's just the IPCC's projections, which are looking at tiny amounts of temperature over very short periods. We don't know the physics that causes the massive movement over very long periods. The likelihood of knowing precisely what moves a half-degree movement when you're looking at 20 degrees here boggles the mind, and as a statistician I can tell you the models are quite weak. Okay. Now, this is a hut probably in Malawi in Africa where the typical rural person lives. And when they live in that hut, and of course only 25% of Africa has access to electricity, this is how they cook inside the hut with sticks, charcoal, or dung to heat, light, and cook food. The respiratory diseases that result from this, as Dr. Bosner has pointed out, are almost criminal to imagine in the 21st century. African life expectancy is about 59 years per person. Here it's 79. China moved from 55 years per person to 75 years per person over the last 20 years because of their electricity-driven economic revolution. If I believed that this was caused by carbon dioxide levels, maybe I'd be marching in the streets in New York City too. It would look like climate catastrophe is upon us. I think I'd be marching, though, only to say, let's decarbonize the United States. I think that, I think that for this woman in Africa, which only uses 5% of the world's carbon emissions, when they're 20 years behind on life expectancy per person because of it, I would give Africa, and I've argued very strongly with my colleagues who work on foreign policy on the left, I'd give Africa a waiver. This picture is of South Africa, where I've lived and taught, teaching kids who come out of the worst townships and ghettos to the university there at the Western Cape. It looks horrible. You got tin sheds put together by people who've recently arrived from Mozambique or Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, because South Africa draws 10% of its people, shall we say, undocumented, just like the United States, because it's an economic power where life is much better than in your own country. But you notice these sticks standing up everywhere. Those are electricity poles. South African's new democratic government has taken the earnings from its well-functioning economy and pretty much provided 100% electricity. And that means 100% clean water, which is the biggest killer of children when the water is dirty. They have managed to do that. Cape Town used to be black at night out in the poor township areas like Khayelitsha. This is what it looks like today. Electricity is everywhere. That has been done by the democratically elected government of South Africa, which your government, under pressure from climate activists, refuses to vote for their coal-fired, scrubbed, modern coal plants at the World Bank because of fears about climate change. This is a democratically elected government that wants to grow. There is a right to development. We must give Africa a waiver, whatever our beliefs are on climate change. Thank you.
Here we go. Okay. For the non-scientist, a little bit of climate science, and then we're going to talk about what else does CO2 impact. The charge has always been CO2 is the major cause of climate change. Well, if you look back about 500 million years and you compare temperature and the CO2, you can get a different answer. There's more than one climate driver. Why is the climate always changing? It's changing because there are at least 22 things that affect it. They all work at a different time scale, so you should never expect that the climate is going to remain the same. This is a good illustration of that. 5 million year record, up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. 400,000 year record, same. 120,000 year record in Greenland, the same. 120-year record. If you looked at last week, the temperature would change during the week, so it never stays the same. Look at it today. We've got CO2 still screaming upward, as they like to say, and the temperature has been flat now for 16 or 18 years. So clearly, Mother Nature is still in control and overriding what the CO2 is doing. This is a real good one here because we go back about 2,000 years. And yes, I agree that these paleo reconstructions aren't exact, but they're certainly directionally indicative. This is where we are today, right up here. The big gaudy red line on here is the CO2 level that came from the IPCC that said it remained essentially flat until the Industrial Revolution here. Yes, the temperature has gotten warmer in the last 150 years, but what made it get warmer for the first 150 years of this 300-year warming period coming out of the Little Ice Age? What made the temperature get colder for 600 years coming out of the medieval warm period into the Little Ice Age? What made it come out here of the Dark Ages and warm for 400 or 500 years into that time when the CO2 level was flat? That's looking at empirical evidence versus their hypothesis. This is the entire Holocene, or the interglacial that we're in right now. We came out of the ice ages back here. If you look at where we are today here, at least half of this time, the Holocene has been warmer than it is today, even though the CO2 level here is 40% higher than it was during these other periods. No correlation there. This is a very important one because this is an ice core from Antarctica that has been looked at by scientists from many, many continents. 20,000 years ago, still in the Ice Age, clear inflection, temperature began to rise here. CO2 level was going along, clear inflection, it began to rise here, except it was 600 or 800 years later than the temperature began to rise. Then temperature dropped, CO2 continued up, leveled out, another 600 years or so in here, and then finally we got up into our current interglacial, and CO2 kept drifting upward, and finally you see the lag again. So this clearly shows that there's not that. It also doesn't show you any positive feedback in the increase in this temperature once the CO2 kicked in, because that's something they try to sell us with all the time. So Mother Nature is still in control, and we have not taken the temperature control away from her yet. The catastrophic forecasts are found only in these unvalidated computer models, and they have not predicted anything accurately yet. Let's look at this real whole world experiment that's going on. Satellite data is showing us that the Earth is getting greener and greener and greener yet, even though we have done everything from paving everything in sight, putting buildings everywhere, clear-cutting the rainforest. And despite that, the carbon dioxide we're putting in the air is overriding all of that, and Earth is continuing to green. We've been feeding the plants, the trees, the food crops exactly what they eat, and they're responding to it just like we would expect to happen. Habitats and ecosystems are becoming more robust. There are over 5,300 real, not model, real studies by the World Agricultural Community that show you exactly what's happening to all of these different plants as we add another 300 parts per million of CO2 to them. And here we go. If we look at the 8 most consumed food crops on Earth over here, when we add 300 parts per million to those, they would increase by an average of nearly 40% if we just let CO2 drift up. This is just more. If you're a coffee lover, it goes up 175%. Or if you're a redneck, I guess you get black-eyed peas up 83%. This is Dr. Idso, who's been mentioned, researcher for the United States government, physicist. Ambient temperature. These plants were planted exactly at the same time in exactly the same soil, right adjacent to each other. The only difference here is added another 150, another 300, another 450 parts per million, and look at the difference in the growth of those plants. Real experiment, not a model. I put this one together. It's just to show this is 400 million years ago when the first land plants came in, and the mosses came in, and the flowering plants came in, and the grasses and everything. Look how high the CO2 level was in here. 5,000 or 6,000 parts per million when they showed up. A few came in at low levels, but most of them came in when the Earth had much higher level CO2. We're here now. Earth is starved of CO2, and as we put the fossil fuel CO2 back in the atmosphere, those plants are loving it. CO2 is not an pollutant. We breathe in 400 parts per million, and we breathe out 40,000 parts per million. Before you go to bed tonight, go breathe on your plants. They will love all of that dessert you'll be feeding them. It's not a pollutant. Even the government admits it. Hal went over some of this yesterday, so I won't repeat it. Okay, this is an important one. Look what would happen if people just realized that carbon dioxide is not driving the climate. We'd let more keep going in. There'd be a general greening of the earth. Ecosystems and habitats would become more robust. Plants and trees would use water more efficiently. The more CO2's in the air, the less they respirate and lose the moisture. Food production per acre would increase, and for anybody that's an environmentalist or whatever, that means that less pristine land would have to yield to the plow. Trillions wouldn't be wasted chasing a non-problem. We could use some of this money that we'd save for alternative energy research, which we will clearly need someday. Economic recovery would be faster and stronger, fewer jobs and industries would move overseas, and we could stop paying countries for having sent them this nasty old CO2 that gave them more food production for 150 years now. All right. this is important. With 80% of the U.S. population polling that they are environmentalists of various degree, obviously, that includes Republicans, Democrats, Independents, liberals, conservative. So any of the people sitting on the fence here, like in the last election, they thought Obama was the environmentalist, when if he had his way and actually reduced this, he'd start browning the earth. And these poor people that you were talking about would have just suffered a whole lot more. So tell them this story. Tell them that the true environmentalists are on the wrong side of this issue. Clearly on the wrong side, and they don't know it because the media won't tell them that. The media likes these catastrophic forecasts. So that's about it. And I think is my 10-minute up, or I have 1 minute left? Okay, anyway. Demand that these people show you their empirical evidence. They don't have it. They do not have empirical evidence. They have unvalidated model projections. Call them out on it. They make it up. They say, oh yeah, there are more wildfires and everything's changing, but we know from what's already been said, even the IPCC admits that we're not having more unusual weather patterns and things like that. So hold their feet to the fire, get out there and give them this message, because you may bring some of these fence-sitting environmentalists around to realize they've been had. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to give my minutes to these other panelists who are not always in Texas, and I'm always around, but for a number of reasons, I can't resist making a few comments. Most humbly, Professor Rossiter did not mention how courageous he is. And he wrote, and this is when I first knew about him, this was a Wall Street Journal editorial last summer called Sacrificing Africa for Climate Change, and a little summary quote the journal often puts in, Western policies seem more interested in carbon dioxide levels than life expectancy. Says that the photo is of a very, very lean young man in Africa with, of course, wind turbines behind him, not solving his needs. This was in a Monday edition, I believed, and Professor Rossiter just reminded me by Wednesday he was fired as a senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, a very prominent left-leaning think tank, by Wednesday. And he is very courageous, not only to write this editorial, but to join a group like this and be very, very public about that. And a couple of just responses to of this panel. Rob Gordon mentioned this project, that the very important project that the Heritage Foundation started several years ago, and asked me to participate. And he talked about, it articulates 8 basic fundamental principles that are aligned with conservative policies, but that we believe really assure genuine environmental protection of real environmental problems. But the first principle is what this panel is about, and the first principle is human beings, the individual human being, is the most important measure of any policy, and certainly environmental policies as well. And anything which hurts real human beings is poor policy, and that's very much what this is about. And I think is so important that that's repeated. And if one does not come to that conclusion about each individual human life by faith, which I do, the founding documents of our country, the Declaration of Independence, when it speaks of the inalienable rights of each individual human being, very important, gets lost in policies like this, which I think are very inimical to basic human welfare. And then a couple points about the topic of the panel, prosperity and poverty, the energy factor. we had copies out. I wrote this fairly long paper called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and probably over half of it is really about the history of the role of the kind of energy in fossil fuels, the density, the abundance, the to-date affordability, the versatility. Stewart's comments about the greening forces of CO2 is one of many. Almost all the materials we use, the versatility of fossil fuels is unbelievable. Controllability, on and on and on. That productivity that was released in England in the Industrial Revolution and spread pretty rapidly to developing countries and is still spreading throughout the world, most benefited when it originated, and still the average worker and the poorest. Lifted them the possibility of a lift from the societies where you had a comfortable, wealthy, small elite, and the bulk of the entire population grappled with subsistence poverty. Life was all about managing to have enough food, enough shelter, enough income. And it increased, the productivity increased at a rate that still, and is sustained, were it not for government policies which restrict that at a rate that still perplexes traditional economists. And that there's a wonderful book to that end and explains in economic terms that I love the title by a Gregory Clark, a historian, called Farewell to Alms. But the extent to which, and he doesn't even get into energy and fossil fuels. He talks about productivity that was made possible and the mechanization that was made possible by fossil fuels. But that's still the case for the poorest in our societies and for the developing world. And I want to speak to first comments I made about no apologies for fossil fuels. I'm a former environmental regulator. I believe there is a real role for appropriate regulation of genuine environmental problems, about pollutants in the air, in the water, which indeed can impair either short-term or chronically human health. CO2, as we I think all know by the getting towards the end of this conference, has no adverse health effects at ambient levels. And yet it's called dirty carbon, which I get very sensitive about. One of the greatest public policy successes of the last 30 years is the dramatic improvement in air quality and water quality in this country. Unbelievable. And yes, the major federal environmental laws passed in the early 70s, they played a role, but the improvement was already beginning in the 50s. And this data you can see on EPA's website. It certainly does not figure regularly in the administrator's speeches, but it's stunning, the extent of it. The sulfur dioxide levels compared to the 1970s, 75% down. Airborne lead, 97% reduced, largely through figuring out how to get it out of gasoline. But it's a great story. It doesn't mean, in my perspective, that the importance and the need for continual environmental management is there. But that would have never happened. That happened for all kinds of reasons interacting together. But it was prosperity. And there are people, economists and statisticians that follow this, and there's a pattern which makes just pure common sense. As a society lifts itself out of very harsh, low productivity and very, very harsh subsistence level poverty, it has the amenities to devote to cleaning the air and cleaning the water, and the technologies which are largely responsible and very efficient means of operating large industrial sources or power plants. Those came from industry. Those were not government programs, but engineers, the likes of many in this room, that figured out how to do something. And I will close by saying I remember I signed as chairman of TCQ the 2 first coal-fired power plants in 28 years in Texas. Their emission levels were unbelievably low. And I know there's a capability for that to continually improve. So prosperity, without prosperity, it would be impossible. But with prosperity, the means of continually reducing any kind of environmental risks as a result of industrial activity is a great victory also of the last 100 years in free societies. So I will sit down and we will all take questions. Thank you.
So I think we have a little time for questions, about 15 minutes, 20 minutes? I'm just kidding you. Well, I gave you a lot to chew on there. So who's got a question?
This is for Dr. Rossiter. Have you seen that you've influenced any others that are on the left side of the spectrum?
No.
Okay,
But let me try to influence you. I know I'm in Texas, and there's a lot of energy people here, and I've had conversations with many of you. You know, there are some problems in terms of foreign companies coming into Africa from China, France, the U.S., the Netherlands, whatever, to do energy extraction. The primary problem is not of the companies making, but it's something they need to do something about. And that is the level of corruption that flows from the level of dictatorship in Africa. I was in Sudan this summer and Uganda this summer. You couldn't find countries that are farther to the left in terms of politics, which is the Sudan. The United States has a full trade embargo on Sudan, trying to overthrow its government. And Uganda, which is a partner of the United States. It sends its troops. They take off their uniforms, but they go to Iraq. They were our contractors, for example, in Iraq. They're fighting for us for our missions in Somalia, and they're in Darfur, for example. Yet in both countries, I was very pessimistic when I came back out, because the energy companies, China in the case of Sudan, and the U.S. and France in the case of Uganda, are coming in, bribing the government ministers, signing sweetheart contracts, not reporting to the people of that country how much has just been paid to which minister with the actual contract for the revenues. So the money is coming into Africa, but it's leaving in the pockets of the ministers of these countries. The corruption levels boggle the mind. And there is an initiative that I encourage all of you who work in the industry to support. It's called Publish What You Pay. It's under the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It simply says anytime you spend any money in Africa as a royalty or for investment or to build something, you have to put up on the web how much you spent and who you handed the check to. That allows civil society, non-governmental groups in those countries, usually dealing with a dictatorship or maybe a repressive government, to watch the money and say, why aren't we getting any benefit out of this money? I know it's not a problem of your making, but you cannot duck this. You need to sort of take a side. It's not proprietary who you wrote the check to, I don't think.
Sir? Okay. There's Mike coming.
Just as a follow-up to that commentary, companies know they're not going to do business unless they're doing that. The other side of the coin is if you recommend, or if what you recommend that they make it public, they'll wind up in court in the U.S. for bribery.
Thank you. I'm certainly not advocating you violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I don't agree that everybody has to bribe to get in Africa. The countries can band together. It's tough in some areas, like arms sales are traditionally corrupt. All the European countries are just, the money's pouring onto the table there because the contracts are so profitable. But I think in the extractive industries, the bribery is not the issue so much as the fact that the revenues are disappearing once they're properly paid in. And I believe a number of companies are taking part in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I realize it is difficult, but when you go travel through Nigeria and you see a country that makes more money before noon than most people most countries see in a lifetime, and you see that life expectancy is still among the lowest in Africa, it's just impossible to turn your back on the problem. I think Publish What You Pay can work.
Okay, sir, I think we'll have a microphone for you.
My question is for Dr. Wiesner. I take it you've worked pretty close in the religious sector, and know what's going on in the churches of America. The Council of Churches, the Methodist Church, which I'm involved with, have very strong environmental groups and have urged the Methodists to show up in Washington or New York this weekend by committees that are at high levels within the church. And I personally, being a Methodist, I'm offended by what my church is doing in this regard. Do you have some comment on that?
Yeah. There we go. Being offended is step one. Step two is you have to communicate to your representatives in the Methodist hierarchy. And you have to communicate not just as an individual, but as one among a whole bunch of individuals. And you have to communicate not just we disagree with you, but here's why we disagree with you. You have to give them the scientific case, you have to give them the economic case, and you have to give them the ethical case, and you need to put those together. That kind of thing is exactly what the Cornwall Alliance has been working on for years. You will find all kinds of helpful stuff about that on our website, cornwallalliance.org. I would also encourage you to be in touch with the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C. They have action programs for all of the major mainline denominations, trying to bring about both spiritual, theological renewal, revival within them, but also trying to bring them to a greater embrace of individual freedom, of limited government, of private property rights, and so on. These are the sorts of things that you would think that they would like, but in fact they were co-opted over a century ago, really, in most of the mainline denominations. They were co-opted by folks who had embraced a Marxist social gospel sort of a position. I've written myself on that in a book called Social Justice, How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. It's a very small book, and in fact you can read the entire thing online. If you just Google my name plus social justice, and then especially quick way, restrict it to site:/frc.org, FamilyResearchCouncil.org. The entire booklet is there online. So you need your ammunition, you need your friends, and you need to speak clearly to your own denomination's leaders.
Okay. All right, we're going to try and squeeze in one more quick question. Sir?
This is for Professor Rossiter. Sorry to put you in the limelight again, but you mentioned about you were recommending a waiver for Africa on these rules, and you said that either you implied or said that for the rest of us we'd still keep the rules. But is that something you recommend, that we have the rules on us, that we be under the regime of the climate control and the CO2 restrictions?
I was being using an if-then bit of logic. If the case had been made, and if you believed, if I believed, that we were in a climate catastrophe caused by anthropogenic warming, then it makes sense to put a price on carbon. And this is why universities are sort of trapped on the divestment issue when their students come and say, we should divest from any stocks that are creating carbon dioxide or methane emissions, because the policies of the universities, they believe that. They believe what the Secretary General of the United Nations has in the Wall Street Journal today. So if you believe it, it is logical you would put a price on carbon and try to decarbonize. I don't happen to. But I'm saying even if I did believe it, I wouldn't apply it to Africa, because the benefits of life expectancy are so huge to be made for them having electricity. I certainly wasn't saying I am convinced by the case, but there's a logic to the case if you can make it. But I don't think it's logical to apply it to a region that's so far behind in life expectancy and only produces 5% of the world's carbon dioxide. Is that clear? Right, of course not. The case has not been made, but see, Just like people say to me, even, this is the argument that my Institute for Policy Studies has made and is their primary argument, which you can see published on their site. Even if it were not true that we're in a climate catastrophe, we should decarbonize because it's bad for us for a number of other economic reasons. And so I was trying to reverse that argument to them and saying, even if I did agree with you that carbon dioxide is a crisis, I wouldn't apply it to Africa. That's all I'm saying.
Let me end with one more if. If Mother Nature's plants could vote, they would vote for coal.
Cal, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, and let me add just one other thing to that too. Frankly, if the folks in the IPCC would actually read Working Group 3's report each time, they would discover that the world's poor are always best off in the highest temperature scenarios, because what drives those scenarios is economic development based upon widespread use of hydrocarbon fuels. And with that highest economic development, you also get the greatest increase in health and longevity. You get the greatest reduction of people at risk in terms of impure drinking water, lack of sewage sanitation, lack of nutrition. All of the various different risks go down the most. I mean, it's really pretty simple. Wealthy people tend to get along, to get through life better than poor people. And in fact, wealthy people live and thrive in all climates from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert. So if we want to help the poor of the world, frankly, concerns over perhaps a 1, 2, 3 degree rise in global average temperature are utterly irrelevant compared with concerns over economic development.
Great. Well, we're the only thing standing between you and lunch, so please give the panel a hand so we can move on here.